G'day guys! If you're anything like me, you will struggle to get your head wrapped around all of the infinite different rules available in Warhammer 40k. When you look at the sheer number of factions that are available and all of the different rules that they have, and then you layer on top of that the constant new releases, new seasons, new additions, it can become an insanely daunting task to keep up to date with the most recent rules. So I delivered a seminar recently at a Risky Rollers event where I gave some information to the players on a really awesome and easy technique that you can use to make sure that you never get caught out by not having the information available. The key to this is asking questions, but specifically what types of questions to ask and how to go about asking those questions so that you can shore up any gaps in your knowledge. So I hope you find this video interesting. This was my first ever live talk, so if this is something that you would like to see more of, or if you would like to attend an event where I deliver a talk like this, let me know in the comments below, and let's get stuck straight into the video, shall we?
Welcome to the Black God!
Cool. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to invite Dean back up to have a chat.
Alrighty.
Competitive stuff. And cheers, guys.
Thanks, Risky Rollers, boys. Alrighty. So first I want to just say thanks to the Risky Rollers boys for inviting me to come and do a bit of a talk for you guys. I've been doing a lot of content on YouTube, you've probably seen it, but this is my first time addressing a actual live audience, so that's a bit exciting. And I hope you guys get some value out of this. There's some new faces here, some people that are relatively new to the tournament scene. So I basically wanted to take some of my experience over the years and share some of the stuff that has helped me get the results that have got me to where I am today. And the topic for today is going to be talking about the types of questions that you can ask your opponents during a game that's going to help facilitate, big wins for you. With the rapid pace of change that GW's got at the moment, where there's a new codex coming out every other week, there's new additions, then there's seasons changes, balanced data slates, all of this sort of stuff. It's, as you probably all know, it's really fucking hard to keep up with. It can be really challenging to understand what rules are changing and when. So one of the simple tricks that you can learn, a skill that you can learn, is what types of questions to ask and how to ask the questions so that you can sort of make up the gap in your knowledge at the table. So instead of trying to learn 50 different codexes before the event and have all that information stored in your head, if you just learn the skill of what types of questions to ask, that will make your life a shit ton easier because you can sort of rely on your opponent to fill in the gaps in your knowledge. So one of the best ways to do this is to ask really broad questions that have a very specific answer. So if you remember that as sort of a bit of a mantra, that when you get to the table, just keep thinking broad questions, specific answers. So an example of this could be something like when you're talking to your opponent, you might ask them, do you have any abilities to reposition units? Now that's a really broad question. That covers redeploying, that covers pre-game moves, that covers abilities to pick a model up off the table and then deep strike it again. All of those sorts of things is all covered in that one broad question, but it has a very specific like yes or no answer. So having that sort of broad question loaded and ready to go when you arrive at the table, it doesn't matter if you're versing a codex you've never seen before, you've never heard of before. If you ask that question, that will inform the way you deploy your army, those sorts of things, because you now know your opponent's going to say, well, actually, yes, I can redeploy units, and I can, turn one, I can use Veil of Darkness, for example, to teleport a unit up. If you ask them if they have any reposition stuff, you're doing a broad stroke, and you're getting a lot of information. There's nothing worse than when you deploy a unit, you think it's somewhere safe, and then you roll off to see who goes first, and your opponent goes, cool, I'm actually going to redeploy over here, and now I can get angles on you, and you're like, fuck, I didn't know he could redeploy. So the trick there is the broader the question, the better. But you have to make sure it's got a specific answer. You can't just ask a broad question like, what does your army do? Because that doesn't have a specific answer. So your opponent's going to really struggle to give you that information. So you've got to sort of juggle the difference between the specific answer and the broad question. Other examples of this could be things like, what is the threat range on that unit? So for example, if you're deploying your unit, you might go, okay, well, what's their threat range? That means how far can it move? Can it advance and charge? What's its advance range? What's its charge range? So if they have an ability to get a 3d6 charge, or if they have an ability to turn an advance roll into an auto 6, or any of those sorts of things, you're covering all of that information in one question, and you're sort of relying on your opponent now to bring that information to you. So that way you're not sitting there going, I've got to sift through 1,000 different stratagems. You're sort of getting that broad question, which is going to help, when the edition changes and every army gets updated at once. Apparently the rumors of 10th edition is going to be a full reset. So having these sorts of skills to, rely on those broad questions is going to be a massive help. This also covers things like, if you want to make sure that you don't die, you can be like, okay, do you have any offensive stratagems? Or when you're allocating attacks into somebody, you say, do you have any defensive stratagems? And that means if they have anything from the ability to put feel no pains on themselves or the ability to interrupt or anything like that, when you ask that sort of question, they're going to bring all that information to you and you don't have to know it. The other side to this coin is if you want to get a little bit more competitive, knowing how to answer questions is also a skill, because you don't necessarily have to give your opponent information that they haven't requested from you. So if the question that your opponent asks you is really, really broad and it doesn't have a specific answer, you're not necessarily obligated to give them any information. So this is something that you'll have to just sort of weigh up on the game on whether or not it's an appropriate time to withhold information or anything like that. Most of the time you're going to just tell them, they're going to be about to do something, you're like, oh, just so you know, I can fight on death. That's the standard that you'll have. But there will be times when you might have gone to and it might be an 8-round event, and you might have won 7 games in a row, and you're now playing off for the big win, and it's really important. You and your opponent charges you, you are not obligated to tell them that you can fight on death. And if they don't ask the question, if they don't ask a question that has that included in that specific answer, then you're not necessarily obligated to tell them. So knowing when you're obligated to answer a question and when to sort of dig for that information is one of the things that you can sort of develop so that no matter what situation you find yourself in, no matter what faction you're versing, it's not going to matter if you don't know what they can do. There are also obviously a lot of things that'll fall in weird sort of areas where it's like hard to know. So for example, you might be versing a Sisters of Battle player and they have that Angel Sacrifice or whatever it's called, where you can only allocate into their characters. That's a kind of a weird rules interaction where it's sort of outside of the norm. So getting familiar with those and also asking your opponent things like, do you have any abilities such as, this, that, and whatever that fall outside of the norm, and prompting them to give you that information is something that is really worthwhile doing. One of the things I do when I'm going to a more serious competitive tournament is I'll actually write down a bunch of these sorts of questions so that when I get to the table, it's just like, cool, I asked these 5 questions and now I don't need to read their codex. I don't need to know all the billion stratagems that people have access to and the different sub-factions and all that sort of stuff. If you just go, cool, what's your turn 1 threat range? Can you reposition units? Can you fight on death? Those sorts of things. And then you can make your decisions informed from there. And having those questions locked and loaded will make your life a ton easier. So that's sort of the general advice that I wanted to sort of share with you guys today, because that's one thing that I see a lot of players, they will then go and cry foul like, oh, he gotcha'd me because he did something. And it's like, well, did you ask? Did you even ask if they have the ability to do that? So to protect yourself and insulate yourself from those gotcha moments, which are those feel bad moments when your opponent does something and you're like, oh, if I had known that you could do that, I wouldn't have done this and I would have won that game. I would have won, but I didn't, because I didn't ask the question. So instead of blaming your opponent for the gotcha, and instead of being upset about the fact that this game's got too much rules bloat, and instead of trying to sort of, put the blame on that, accepting the responsibility and going, well, what can I do within this environment to make sure that that doesn't happen again, is a very powerful thing that you can do. And the way to do that is to ask questions. Just ask as many questions as you can, but keeping in mind that mantra of broad questions with specific answers. Because the other side to this is if you ask your opponent a question and they give you a specific answer, you can then hold them to that answer. So for example, if you're versing like a knight player and you go, okay, what's the threat range on that knight? And they say, well, he moves 12 and he charges 2d6, so 24 inches. And you're like, cool, I'm going to deploy my unit 24.1 inches away, so you can't charge me. And they're like, yep, cool. if you do that and then in their turn they move and they're like, oh, actually, I have a stratagem for advance and charge, you can be like, well, sorry, you can't use it because I specifically asked you that. I've deployed 25 inches away with the intent that you will not be able to charge me. You agreed, so therefore they can't do it. So asking them that question with a specific answer allows you to actually hold them to that answer. Whereas if you don't ask the question, like if you just go, what's its movement characteristic, and they go 12, and then you think to yourself, okay, 12 plus 12-inch charge, 24 inches, if you deploy, you didn't ask the question, well then when they do that advance and charge stratagem, that's not them pulling a gotcha, that's actually your fault for having not asked the right questions. So yeah, that's more or less all I wanted to sort of talk about was the idea of asking questions, making sure that that's part of your way of approaching the game. You know, when you're writing your list, when you're doing all the different things that you need to do when preparing for a competitive event, one of the things that you should be building into that process is thinking about what kind of questions should I be asking my opponent. And you'll also find that it will accelerate your development as a player because you'll be learning so much more about every faction without ever having to read the book. I don't know about you guys, but reading through a codex for an army that I don't play is like nails on a chalkboard. It's irritating. But asking your opponent, what can your army do, will give you the specific stuff you need to know. Even watching like a tactics video or an article or something like that about a faction, you'll read it, but there's so much information in there. The chances of you remembering it 3 months from now when you verse that faction is almost zero. So developing the skill to go, what are the questions that I want to ask is really important. And keeping in mind that the broader the question, the better, as long as it does have a specific answer. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to discuss. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask on that subject while I'm up here? If you do, feel free to go nuts. If not, you can always just reach out to me on the social medias or whatever.
Might be a simple one, but like threat range obviously for melee, like armies.
Yep.
But how would you go about asking them about shooting armies? Let's say an Imperial Guard, you're like, how would you do a broad question about, instead of going, how far can everything shoot, and then listing off?
So there's a few things you can do. One of the easiest ones to do is basically say to your opponent, if I deploy here, do you agree that you can't shoot me turn one, right? So you'd ask him things like, okay, well what's the maximum movement and shooting range on that unit? So say they got a 24-inch range gun and a 6-inch move, you know that's got a 30-inch threat range. So you go, cool, well I'm going to deploy out of line of sight of this stuff. You agree that that's out of line of sight, and I'm outside of 30 inches of whatever this unit is with the 24-inch range. Then you can say to them, okay, you agree that if I deploy here, you will not be able to shoot me turn one. And then if they say yes, you go, cool, well there was a broad question because you've asked them, will you be able to, which includes, you know, veil breaker plate, it includes, you know, teleporting, it includes advancing and shooting, it includes all of these infinite number of possible combinations that people can conjure, but it includes that in such a way that you're prompting them to provide the information. So if you go, I deployed here, they're actually obligated to say, well no, because if you deploy it there, I actually can do this in order to shoot you. And that gives you an opportunity to go, okay, well then I won't deploy it there, I'll deploy it somewhere else. And sometimes taking an extra 5 or 10 minutes at the start, especially in turns like 1 and 2, to really nail these things is what will result in you winning a game. I'm sure we've all had those situations where you have a disastrous turn 1 and 2, and then it feels like no matter what I do in turns 3, 4, and 5, I can't claw it back. I've just made one critical mistake early in the game, can just cause you to completely lose. So spending that extra 5, 10 minutes going, hang on, I just want to make sure that if I deploy like this, I'm not going to just lose turn 1. Spend that extra minute, spend that extra time, ask those questions, make sure you get confirmation from your opponent so that you know, you're not just going, oh, I'm going to assume that you can't do this. That's really important. And yeah, that should help with, especially in the shooting matchup. Like the combat matchup's a little bit easier, right? Because it's pretty one-dimensional, whereas shooting, they've got firing angles and out of line of sight shooting and things like that. So it can be a little bit more tricky with the shooting matchup. But generally, it's the same sort of principle, right? You've got movement range, threat range on guns, you know, ability to reposition units. That's a big one. And that should help with that. Good question, though. Yeah. It's about 4 inches, but it's really thick.
I was just wondering, even if you get confirmation, so in the advance and judge example you were saying, If they play the strat, is it always just up to the TO if you just say, we agreed to this, or you didn't, you weren't about that, but you're trying to do it anyway?
So it's very, very rare that you'll find a situation where your opponent says, that they can't do something, and then they turn around and change their mind and try to do it. Yeah. Very, very rare. Most of the time, if you go, oh, you're 24-inch threat range, cool, I'm 25 inches away, and then in their turn they remember, oh, I can actually advance and charge. It's very rare that your opponent's going to actually try to do it. When you say to them, well, hang on, mate, I deployed 24 inches away specifically for this reason, so no, most opponents are going to be like, oh, fair enough, right? Yeah. In those very rare cases where somebody goes, no, well, I can do it, so I'm going to do it, that's when you just get the TO over, you explain it, and any TO worth his salt, unless your opponent then lies and says, I didn't say that, I didn't agree to that, but in that case, you're dealing with a wanker, and what are you going to do, right? Like, there's not much you can do at that case. And those people, they get weeded out pretty fast, because if he does that to you, and then next weekend he does it to somebody else, and then a month later they get a reputation, and immediately the TOs just cotton onto it and go, okay, this guy's not an honest narrator, he's telling lies, so they'll generally rule in favor of the other person. So it's rare that happens. It does happen, it's not unheard of. But generally speaking, the first point of call would be just the second they start disagreeing, you'd be like, I'm just going to get a TO, because I'm not here to have an argument with you. Yeah. So we're disagreeing about something, let's get someone to make a ruling. Yeah. And then when they start raging, you're just like, oh, well, I'm just going to be calm, I'm going to be chill. You're clearly the problem here.
I've got a serious question. How do you approach, say, a player who might be asserting a certain kind of dominance on the table? I know it's not really a rules question as such, but more of an etiquette question. So if you have a player that you don't necessarily, like you might not know the rules of the army or what they're playing against, what are some ways in which you can go about mitigating a player who might be using their stature or their position or something like that against you, whether it's malicious or not? Yeah. In that situation, like what was? I
think players need to become a little bit more comfortable going to the TO. Like, just being like, you know what, this player is making me uncomfortable for whatever reason. Like, they're doing something, like whether it be their language might be, upsetting you, or whether it might be just their body language might be just putting you off, or those sorts of things. Don't be afraid to just go reach out to the TO and just be like, look, this guy's doing X, Y, Z. Can you watch over the game? Can you come check in on us every half an hour or so? Most TOs, because it's in the TO's interest, they don't want the event to be drama. They don't want to have to deal with that. As a TO, the worst thing in the world is when you see two people like shouting at each other, because you're like, fuck, I intentionally didn't have kids because I don't want to deal with this shit, and now I have to deal with these giant man babies and crying over their toys. Like, TOs hate it. So if you prompt a TO in advance and say, look, this guy's, his energy's off and I feel like he's gonna try some shit, you say that to the TO and they will appreciate it greatly. They'll be like, yep, cool, I'll come over, I'll keep an eye on it. And that's probably the best way to deal with those situations, because TOs want to stop that. Yes?
Just to clarify that, surely you would give one warning at least to the player first in question.
Of course, of course.
Then you go to TO.
Of course, yes. So
many rings ago, that happened to me. I did one fat joke, and the person wasn't the largest size, because it gets nerdable. He said, oh, I believe you know about fat jokes. Did not personally go up to that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously your first point of call, if it's also tricky because sometimes you can't quite put your finger on what it is that your opponent's doing that's causing the problem, like what you were saying, using stature and things like that. But generally speaking, like, we're all adults here. If somebody's doing something that's upsetting you, you should be able to just say, look, mate, I don't appreciate the way that you're doing this, that, and whatever. Like, there'll be games where you ask your, I've had this before, and I've been playing 40K for like 20 years. This happened once, where I've asked my opponent a question and he's just thrown his list at me and gone, you can read it. And I'm like, well, could you tell me what your relics are? And he's like, read it. I'm like, ugh. So I was just like, whatever, mate. And then like in the first, and I was like, look, I don't appreciate that. If you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it, and I would appreciate it if you answered my questions. Let's be reasonable here. And he's like, man, clock's on you, chess clock's on you. Here's my codex. If you want to read it, read it. So I just immediately went got the TO, and I was like, TO, he's being completely unreasonable. And it's like, it's one of those things where nowhere in the rule book does it say you must answer your opponent's questions, you know. But there is a code of conduct at most tournaments. I'm sure Risky Rollers have their own code of conduct that's all written out. Most tournaments these days will, and in that it will specify basically don't be a wanker, and we all know what that means, you know. Like, so the first thing you would do is say to your opponent, yeah, I'd appreciate it if you would answer my questions. I'm not being unreasonable to ask what your warlord trait is, you know. And you honestly can't expect me to find it in your list, then go and get your codex, find it in your codex, spend 10 minutes when you could have just told me my warlord trait lets me do X. So it's very, very rare that that will happen. But yeah, talk to your opponent, tell them that you think you're being unreasonable. If they persist, that's when you get the TO. And on that, TOs need to be more comfortable just yellow carding that sort of behavior. Just being like, look, that's unacceptable behavior, straight out the gate. That's a yellow card, do it again, and you'll be out of the event. And as soon as people start doing that, as soon as the community start being a little bit more strict on that behavior, then this will just evaporate completely. But I do want to make sure it's clear that that is very, very rare. Most people are completely reasonable, and probably 1 in every 1,000 games is like that. So I think that's it's a good question though. Yeah, cool. All right, well, thanks for sticking around. I hope you guys found that at least somewhat valuable. The questions thing is something that as soon as I sort of clicked in my head, I was like, wow, if I ask questions, my opponent just spills the beans and tells me what their army does, and now I don't need to learn their army. When I had that realization, I immediately saw a massive improvement in my tournament results. And given that a lot of you are relatively new to the competitive scene, I just wanted to share that with you guys so that we could see, you know, some improvement across the board, because that's what we're all here for. So yeah, thanks for sticking around. And yeah. All right, let's go get fucked up. Alrighty guys, I hope you enjoyed that. If you do, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all that good shit, and let me know how you feel about this format of video where I basically am going to tournaments around the country and I'm delivering these talks for newer players who are looking to get into the competitive scene and wanting to learn a little bit more about how they can do that in such a way where they're not going to have those sorts of gotchas and those sorts of things. So basically I'm going around and teaching some sort of 40K fundamentals. And yeah, let me know if that's something you're interested in. If you'd like to show your support for the channel, you can pick up merchandise like this. You can get dice over my Patreon. There's objective markers available, all sorts of different ways that you can show your support for the channel. And also over on Patreon, I do one-on-one coaching sessions. So if this is the sort of stuff you find interesting, then I can tailor it to your specific needs and your specific experience over on Patreon. So check that out if you're interested. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, comment, all that good shit. And I will see you in the next video. Cheers.
Welcome to the Black God.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable,